To recommend the study of eloquence and describe its force and the great dignity it confers upon those who have acquired it is neither our present design nor has any necessary connection with it. But I'll not hesitate to affirm that whether it is acquired by art or practice or the mere powers of nature, it is the most difficult of all attainments. For each of the 5 branches of which it is said to consist is, of itself, a very important art, from whence it may be easily conjectured how great and arduous must be the profession which unites and comprehends them all. Greece alone is a sufficient witness of this, for though she was fired with a wonderful love of eloquence, and has long since excelled every other nation in the practice of it, yet she had all the rest of the arts much earlier, and had not only invented, but even perfected them, a considerable time before she was mistress of the full powers of speaking. But when I direct my eyes to Greece, your beloved Athens, my Atticus, first strikes my sight, and is the brightest object in my view, for in that illustrious city the orator first made his appearance, and it is there we shall find the earliest records of eloquence, and the first specimens of a discourse conducted by rules of art. But even in Athens there is not a single production now extant which reveals any taste for ornament, or seems to have been the effort of a real orator before the time of Pericles, whose name is prefixed to some orations which still remain, and his contemporary Thucydides, who flourished not in the infancy of the state, but when it was arrived at its full maturity of power. It is, however, supposed that Pisistratus, who lived many years before, together with Solon, who was something older, and Cleisthenes, who survived them both, were very able speakers for the age they lived in. But some years after these, as may be collected from the Attic histories, came the above-mentioned Themistocles, who was said to have been as much distinguished by his eloquence as by his political abilities. And after him, the celebrated Pericles, who, though adorned with every kind of excellence, was most admired for his talent of speaking. Cleon, also their contemporary, though a turbulent citizen, was allowed to be a tolerable orator. These were immediately succeeded by Alcibiades, Critias, Theramenes, whose manner of speaking may be easily inferred from the writings of Thucydides, who lived at the same time. Their discourses were nervous and stately, full of sententious remarks, and so excessively concise as to be sometimes obscure. But as soon as the force of a regular and well-adjusted speech was understood, a sudden crowd of rhetoricians appeared, such as Gorgias of Leontini, Thrasymachus of Chalcedon, Protagoras of Abderos, and Hippias of Elea, who were all held in great esteem, with many others of the same age, who professed, it must be owned, rather too arrogantly, to teach their pupils how the worse might be made by the force of eloquence to appear the better cause. But these were openly opposed by the famous Socrates, who, by an adroit method of arguing, which was peculiar to himself, took every opportunity to refute the principles of their art. His instructive conferences produced a number of intelligent men, and philosophy is said to have derived her birth from him. Not the doctrine of physics, which was of an earlier date, but that philosophy which treats of men and manners, and of the nature of good and evil. But as this is foreign to our present subject, we must defer the philosophers to another opportunity, and return to the orators, whom I have ventured to make a sort of digression. When the professors, therefore, above mentioned, were in the decline of life, Isocrates made his appearance, whose house stood open to all Greece, as the school of eloquence. He was an accomplished orator, an excellent teacher, though he did not display his talents in the law courts, but cherished and improved that glory within the walls of his academy, which, in my opinion, no poet has ever yet acquired. He composed many valuable specimens of his art, taught the principles of it to others, and not only excelled his predecessors in every part of it, but first discovered that a certain meter should be observed in prose, though totally different from the measure in rhyme of the poets. Before him, the artificial structure and harmony of language was unknown, or if there are any traces of it to be discovered, they appear to have been made without design, which perhaps will be thought a beauty. But whatever it may be deemed, It was, in the present case, the effect rather of native genius, or of accident, than of art and observation. For mere nature itself will measure and limit our sentences, and by a convenient compass of words, and when they are thus confined to a moderate flow of expression, they will frequently have a rhythmical cadence. For the ear alone can decide what is full and complete, and what is deficient, and the course of our language will necessarily be regulated by our breath, in which it is excessively disagreeable not only to fail, but even to labor. After Isocrates came Lysias, who, though not personally engaged in forensic causes, was a very artful and elegant composer, and such a one as you might almost venture to pronounce a complete orator. For Demosthenes is the man who approaches the character so nearly that you may apply it to him without hesitation. No keen, no artful turns could have been contrived for the pleadings he has left behind him, which he did not readily discover. Nothing could have been expressed with such greater nicety, or more clearly and poignantly than it has already been clearly expressed by him. And nothing greater, nothing more rapid and forcible, nothing adorned with a nobler elevation, either of language or sentiment, can be conceived in what is to be found in his orations. He was soon rivaled by his contemporaries, Hyperides, Aeschines, Lycurgus, Dinarchus, and Demades, none of whose writings are extant, with many others that might be mentioned. For this age was adorned with a profusion of good orators, and the genuine strength and vigor of eloquence appears to me to have subsisted to the end of this period, which was distinguished by a natural beauty of composition, without disguise or affection. When these orators were in the decline of life, they were succeeded by Demetrius of Phalerum, who was then in the prime of youth. He was indeed a man of greater learning than any of them, but was fitter to appear on the parade than in the field, and accordingly he rather pleased and entertained the Athenians than inflamed their passions, and marched forth into the dust and heat of action, not from a weather-beaten tent, but from the shady recesses of Theophrastus, a man of consummate erudition. He was the first who relaxed the force of eloquence, and gave her a soft and tender air, and he rather chose to be agreeable, as indeed he was, than great and striking. But agreeable in such a manner as rather charmed than warmed the mind of the hearer. His greatest ambition was to impress his audience with a high opinion of his elegance, and not, as Eupolis relates of Pericles, to sting as well as to please. You see, then, in the very city in which eloquence was born and nurtured, how late it was before she grew to maturity. For before the time of Solon and Pisistratus, we meet with no one who is so much as mentioned for his talent of speaking. These, indeed, if we compute by the Roman date, may be reckoned very ancient, but if that by the Athenians, we shall find them to be moderns. For, though they flourished in the reign of Servius Tullius, Athens had then subsisted much longer than Rome has at present. I have not, however, the least doubt that the power of eloquence has always been more or less conspicuous. For Homer, we may suppose, would not have ascribed such superior talents of speech to Ulysses and Nestor, one of whom he celebrates for his force and the other for his sweetness, unless the art of speaking had then been held in some esteem. Nor could the poet himself have been master of such an ornamental style, and so excellent a vein of oratory as we actually find in him. The time indeed in which he lived is undetermined, but we are certain that he flourished many years before Romulus, for he was at least of as early a date as the elder Lycurgus, the legislator of the Spartans. But a particular attention to the art and a greater ability in the practice of it may be observed in Pisistratus. He was succeeded in the following century by Themistocles, who, according to the Roman date, was a person of the remotest antiquity. But according to that of the Athenians, he was almost a modern, for he lived when Greece was in the height of her power, but when the city of Rome had but lately freed herself from the shackles of regal tyranny. For the dangerous war with the Volsci, who were headed by Coriolanus, then a voluntary exile, happened nearly at the same time as the Persian War. And we may add that the fate of both commanders was remarkably similar, each of them, after distinguishing himself as an excellent citizen, being driven from his country by the wrongs of an ungrateful people, went over to the enemy, and each of them repressed the efforts of his resentment by a voluntary death. But nearly at the time we are speaking of, though somewhat later, lived the above-mentioned Pericles, the illustrious son of Xanthippus, who first improved his eloquence by the friendly aids of literature. Not that kind of literature which treats professedly of the art of speaking, of which there was then no regular system, but after he had studied under Anaxagoras, the natural philosopher. He easily transferred his capacity from abstruse and intricate speculations to forensic and popular debates. All Athens was charmed with the sweetness of his language, and not only admired him for his fluency, but was awed by the superior force and the terrors of his eloquence. This age, therefore, which may be considered as the infancy of the art, furnished Athens with an orator who almost reached the summit of his profession. For an emulation to shine in speech is not usually found among a people who are either employed in settling the form of their government, or engaged in war, or struggling with difficulties, or subject to the arbitrary power of kings. Eloquence is the attendant of peace, the companion of ease and prosperity, and the tender offspring of a free and a well-established constitution. Aristotle, therefore, informs us that when the tyrants were expelled from Sicily and private property, after a long interval of servitude, was determined by public trials, the Sicilians, Corax and Theseus, for this people in general were very quick and acute and had a natural turn for controversy, first attempted to write precepts on the art of speaking. Before them, he says, there was no one who spoke by method and rules of art, though there were many people who discoursed very sensibly, and generally from written notes. But Protagoras took the pains to compose a number of dissertations on such leading and general topics as are now called commonplaces. Gorgias, he adds, did the same, and wrote panegyrics and invectives on every subject, for he thought it was the province of an orator to be able either to exaggerate or extenuate as occasion might require. Antiphon of Ramus composed several essays of the same species, and, according to Thucydides, a very respectable writer, who was present to hear him, pleaded a capital cause in his own defense, with as much eloquence as had ever yet been displayed by any man. But Lysias was the first who openly professed the art, and after him Theodorus, being better versed in the theory than the practice of it, begun to compose orations for others to pronounce, but reserved the method of doing it to himself. In the same manner, Isocrates at first disclaimed the art, but wrote speeches for other people to deliver, on which account, being often prosecuted for assisting, contrary to law, to circumvent one or another of the parties in judgment, he left off composing orations for other people, and wholly applied himself to writing rules and systems. Thus, then, we have traced the birth and origin of the orators of Greece, who were, indeed, very ancient, as I have before observed. If we compute by the Roman annals, but of a much later date, if we reckon by their own, for the Athenian state had signalized itself by a variety of great exploits, both at home and abroad, a considerable time before she was ravished with the charms of eloquence. But this noble art was not common to Greece in general, but almost peculiar to Athens. For who has ever heard of an Argive, or a Corinthian, or a Theban orator at the times we are speaking of? Unless perhaps some merit of the kind may be allowed to Epaminondas, who was a man of uncommon erudition, but I have never read of a Lacedaemonian orator, from the earliest period of time to the present. For Menelaus himself, though said by Homer to have possessed a sweet elocution, is likewise described as a man of few words. Brevity, indeed, upon some occasions, is a real excellence, but it is very far from being compatible with the general character of eloquence. The art of speaking was likewise studied and admired beyond the limits of Greece, and the extraordinary honors which were paid to oratory have perpetuated the names of many foreigners who had the happiness to excel in it. For no sooner had eloquence ventured to sail from the Piraeus, but she traversed all the isles, and visited every part of Asia, till at last she infected herself with their manners, and lost all the purity and healthy complexion of the Attic style, and indeed had almost forgot her native language. The Asiatic orators, therefore, though not to be undervalued for the rapidity and the copious variety of their elocution, were certainly too loose and luxuriant, but the Rhodians were of a sounder constitution, and more resembled the Athenians. So much then for the Greeks, for perhaps what I have already said of them is more than was necessary.